The summer of 1944 in Normandy was a season like no other. The air hung heavy with smoke and dust, a relentless reminder of the chaos unfolding across the European continent. For the German army, the dream of a fortress Europe was unraveling, and retreat became an everyday reality. Roads were clogged with the wreckage of tanks and trucks, while the distant roar of artillery and the piercing drone of aircraft formed a constant, unnerving backdrop. Amid this turmoil, a small group of German nurses found themselves caught in the eye of the storm, facing a world that seemed to be collapsing around them. These women had spent years dedicating their lives to healing. Their white uniforms, once symbols of care and hope, were now streaked with dirt, sweat, and the blood of soldiers they could not save. Each day brought new challenges: long hours tending to the wounded, the omnipresent fear of attack, and the psychological weight of witnessing the horrors of war. Yet nothing had prepared them for the ultimate test. The moment when the enemy would come knocking at their door. Propaganda had drilled a single, unyielding message into their minds: surrender was shameful, and the Americans were merciless. They expected shouting, rough handling, and the kind of humiliation that would strip them of their dignity. But in the summer sun of Normandy, reality refused to follow the script they had been taught. When the American soldiers finally appeared, rifles held, wary faces peering from beneath their helmets, the nurses' anticipation of cruelty met an unexpected calm. Instead of orders barked and chains clanged, there was a quiet gesture, a simple invitation toward a field hospital. In that moment, disbelief washed over them like a tidal wave. The battlefield noise, the constant tension, the years of indoctrination all seemed to pause. One nurse, trembling, hesitated, unsure if the invitation was genuine or a cruel trick. Yet when an American doctor spoke the words, "Inside, you can help," everything shifted. What had been a moment of fear became a doorway to purpose, a chance to wield their skills not for destruction, but for life itself. As they stepped into the tent, the nurses encountered a world both familiar and alien. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the hum of urgent activity. Stretchered soldiers from both sides of the conflict lay side by side, equal in pain, equal in need. The nurses' hands, trained for care, moved instinctively, guided by skill and conscience rather than fear or ideology. They began to see that in this place, the rules they had been taught no longer applied. Compassion was not weakness, and healing did not acknowledge the boundaries of nationality. This is a story about courage, about the quiet strength that emerges when humanity transcends conflict. It is about moments that challenge everything we think we know and reveal truths that endure long after the battle has ended. As we explore the journey of these nurses in Normandy, witnessing their fears, their surprises, and the lessons they carry forward, you will see that even in the darkest times, the choice to act with care and respect can illuminate a path forward. If this story captivates you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the remarkable tales that history has to offer. Join us as we uncover the courage, resilience, and humanity of those who faced the unimaginable and discover what it truly means to stand for life in the midst of war. For months, the German nurses had carried with them a heavy burden far beyond the physical exhaustion of tending to the wounded. It was a weight born of fear, expectation, and the unrelenting influence of Nazi propaganda. Every day, every whispered order, every leaflet they read reinforced a single, terrifying narrative. If capture came at the hands of the Americans, there would be no mercy, no understanding, and no chance for dignity. In their minds, surrender was not just a misstep, it was an unforgivable transgression, a gateway to humiliation, interrogation, and a kind of punishment that transcended the ordinary horrors of war. They had grown accustomed to seeing the world through the lens of strict hierarchy and rigid ideology, where obedience was paramount and deviation from the reach's expectations was met with swift and uncompromising consequences. Their training, both professional and ideological, had intertwined so tightly that the two were nearly indistinguishable. They were taught to care, yes, but only in service of a system that had labeled the rest of humanity as lesser, unworthy, and, in many cases, expendable. As the nurses navigated the crumbling roads of Normandy, stepping over the remnants of tanks and debris that marked the retreating German forces, each passing moment seemed to reinforce the prophecy of fear that had been instilled in them. Their uniforms, once crisp and emblematic of a noble purpose, had become a second skin smeared with dirt and blood, a testament to the relentless demands of a conflict that had taken everything from them, the thought of encountering enemy soldiers, who they had been conditioned to see as ruthless and vindictive, filled their hearts with a tension so deep it pressed upon every movement, every breath. In their minds, the Americans were the embodiment of danger, an unpredictable force whose very presence could strip them of not only their freedom but their sense of self. The warnings had not been subtle, from posters on the walls to hushed remarks in the corridors. The message was everywhere, painting surrender as a descent into indignity and suffering so profound that it was almost unimaginable. Yet even amid the terror and expectation, there existed a flicker of professional instinct, a muscle memory that refused to be suppressed. Their hands, trained for precision and care, carried the invisible weight of responsibility. A knowledge that lives depended upon their skill. Every bandage wrapped, every patient monitored, every whispered instruction to a fellow nurse reinforced the dichotomy between what they had been taught to fear and what they knew they could do. There was a tension in this duality, a friction that gnawed at the edges of their consciousness. The fear of punishment loomed large, but the instinct to heal remained unbroken, quietly asserting itself beneath layers of indoctrination and dread. The journey toward eventual capture was slow, punctuated by moments of near panic and bursts of adrenaline. Each encounter with the advancing American forces was anticipated as a trial, a test of endurance under scrutiny and coercion. Their imaginations painted scenes of shouting officers, harsh commands, and physical intimidation, and in their minds, these visions were almost as real as the mud and blood under their boots. Every step forward was accompanied by the quiet rehearsal of compliance, the mental preparation for humiliation that seemed inevitable. In this crucible of anxiety, the nurses experienced a psychological tension that was both exhausting and profoundly disorienting. The narratives of propaganda and the reality of the battlefield merged into a fog of expectation, making every rustle of movement, every shout in the distance, a potential herald of disaster. And yet, even in the darkest corners of anticipation, there remained a subtle thread of human curiosity, a questioning born not of defiance but of sheer necessity. What would happen when they faced the Americans, not as abstract enemies but as flesh and blood human beings? This question, at once terrifying and strangely compelling, lingered like a shadow over their every thought. It was a question that challenged the narrative that had been forced upon them, that whispered of the possibility that the world could exist outside the strict binaries of propaganda, fear, and obedience. Even as they braced for the worst, preparing themselves mentally for the humiliation and punishment they had been told to expect, there was an unspoken recognition that the world was larger, stranger, and more unpredictable than any lesson had ever conveyed. In the midst of this inner turbulence, the nurses maintained their roles with remarkable steadiness, moving between the wounded, assessing injuries, and performing the tasks that their training demanded. Each action was a careful negotiation between fear and duty, between the terror of capture and the ingrained instinct to provide care. As they approached the moment of actual surrender, that anticipation of harsh treatment intensified, yet it was now tempered by an underlying awareness. Whatever awaited them on the other side, they were not merely passive participants in a story written by ideology and fear. They were skilled professionals, capable of shaping their own response to the uncertainty before them. It was against this backdrop of dread and expectation that the American soldiers finally appeared. The nurses' eyes, trained to anticipate command and coercion, scanned for aggression, for the cruel hand of retribution. Yet what they encountered instead was a startling absence of hostility. The Americans did not shout, did not push, did not brandish weapons in a display of dominance. There was no trace of the punishment they had imagined for months on end. Instead, there was a quiet gesture, an invitation, an unspoken recognition of the nurses' humanity and skill. The tension that had coiled so tightly within them began to unravel, replaced by an astonishment that was almost physical in its intensity, as if the very ground beneath them had shifted. In that moment, the expectation of humiliation and punishment, meticulously cultivated by propaganda and reinforced by fear, collided with a reality that was both disarming and profoundly transformative. The nurses had entered this encounter braced for degradation, yet found instead acknowledgement, trust, and a rare affirmation of their professional and human worth. Their world, so rigidly defined by ideology and expectation, had cracked open just enough to reveal that the enemy, contrary to every warning and every instinct, could show respect, and that their skill, their dedication, and their very humanity mattered in ways that no doctrine could anticipate. From the depths of terror and expectation emerged a lesson that would shape them far beyond the battlefields of Normandy. The human capacity for decency, for recognition of skill and compassion, can appear even in the most unlikely of places, transforming fear into a bridge for understanding and opening a path to something far larger than themselves. The moment the American soldiers finally reached the exhausted, battle-worn group of German nurses, the scene defied every expectation that had been etched into their minds over years of indoctrination and fear. For months, they had anticipated harsh treatment, humiliation, and punishment, envisioning a confrontation that would strip them of dignity and leave them trembling in the wake of victory's cruelty. Yet what unfolded before them was a starkly different reality, one that would challenge the very foundation of everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies. The Americans did not approach with shouts or raised rifles, nor did they attempt to force the nurses into submission with physical intimidation. Instead, their movements were measured, calm, and deliberate, conveying neither threat nor triumph, but something altogether unexpected. An invitation. The nurses, conditioned to brace for violence and degradation, froze in disbelief, their hands instinctively gripping the edges of their blood-stained uniforms, as if anchoring themselves to the last vestiges of certainty in a world that had grown increasingly chaotic. As the soldiers gestured toward the sprawling field hospital set up behind the front lines, the nurses struggled to comprehend the meaning of the gesture. They had been taught that surrender meant the end of agency, that their roles as caregivers would be rendered meaningless under the authority of the enemy. And yet here they were, being invited to participate in the very work that had defined their lives for years. The invitation was unspoken, yet it carried a weight that transcended words, a subtle acknowledgement of their skill, their experience, and their humanity. One nurse later recalled the dizzying vertigo of that moment, the tremor in her knees and the rapid beating of her heart, as she realized that what she had been conditioned to fear might never occur. The American doctor who approached her offered a simple phrase, softly spoken but resonant with meaning. Inside, you can help. Those words, unadorned and direct, became a bridge across the chasm of ideology, suspicion, and war. A statement that her hands were needed not for punishment but for healing, not for obedience but for collaboration. Crossing the threshold into the hospital tent was like stepping into another world. The harsh, metallic tang of the battlefield, the constant echo of distant artillery, and the ever-present spectre of violence faded into the background, replaced by the ordered chaos of medical care. Stretchered soldiers. Some American, some German, lay side by side, each one equally vulnerable, each one equally in need of attention. The nurses' initial hesitation gave way to the instinctive precision of their training, and soon their hands moved with a practiced grace. Cleaning wounds, wrapping bandages, and administering care. The Americans did not hover over them with strict orders or condescending directives. Instead, they communicated with a quiet authority that respected expertise, offering guidance when necessary and trusting the nurses to act within their professional knowledge. This approach was startling to the German nurses, whose entire experience of military hierarchy had been shaped by a rigid, punitive structure. In the Wehrmacht, mistakes were met with scorn, initiative was often discouraged, and obedience was valued above all else. Here, in the American field hospital, they were treated not as prisoners or inferiors but as colleagues, collaborators, and professionals. One nurse, Anna Vogel, would later describe standing beside an American doctor at the bedside of a severely wounded soldier from Bavaria, initially paralyzed by instinctive fear and mistrust. Yet in the calm eyes of the doctor, she saw no malice, no triumph, only urgency and focus. And in that moment she realized that her skills were recognized and valued, regardless of nationality or past allegiance. The act of helping, of exercising judgment and expertise, became a reclamation of self, a restoration of identity that had been threatened by years of indoctrination and the uncertainty of captivity. The nurses' contributions quickly became indispensable. In treating both American and German patients, they discovered a new dimension to their work. The boundaries imposed by ideology could be set aside in favor of a shared human mission. The act of caregiving, stripped of propaganda and prejudice, revealed a universal truth that transcended uniforms, ranks, and past enmities. They observed American doctors, some civilian physicians drafted into service, attending to the wounded with the same meticulous care, whether the patient bore the stars and stripes or the black and red insignia of the German military. There was no hierarchy of value, no preferential treatment, only the deliberate application of skill and compassion. In watching these interactions, the nurses began to question the moral and professional assumptions they had carried for years, realizing that true strength lay not in domination or cruelty but in calm, competent, and impartial care. Interactions between the German nurses and the American staff were not without moments of awkwardness or cultural friction. Language barriers required gestures, rudimentary phrases, and careful observation. Yet even these moments carried lessons. They learned that patience, humility, and adaptability could bridge divides that propaganda had long insisted were unbridgeable. Simple acts, handing over instruments, exchanging advice, or demonstrating a particular dressing technique became exchanges of mutual respect and recognition, reinforcing the nurses' sense that their skills mattered, their humanity was acknowledged, and their dignity intact. Over time, the nurses began to internalize a subtle but profound shift. Captivity did not necessarily equate to humiliation, and the enemy could act with decency and respect even in the midst of war. They discovered that the Americans' treatment was both a pragmatic recognition of expertise and a quiet moral experiment, one that challenged the nurses to reconcile their indoctrination with the evidence of what they saw and experienced. The act of being trusted to help, to contribute meaningfully to the healing of others, became a defining moment, transforming fear into purpose, mistrust into cautious engagement, and compliance into genuine collaboration. Through this experience, the German nurses came to understand that dignity is not granted by circumstance or rank, but earned and recognized through respect for competence and the shared commitment to human life. The field hospital became more than a medical facility. It was a stage where the rigid constructs of ideology were tested and softened by simple acts of trust and professionalism. Every patient treated, every instrument handled with care, every word spoken with respect contributed to a quiet revolution in the nurses' understanding of themselves, the enemy, and the moral possibilities that exist even amid the chaos of war. In the midst of surrender and uncertainty, they found not degradation, but the affirmation that their skills mattered, their humanity counted, and their capacity to act with compassion could survive even in the shadow of conflict. As the days in the American field hospitals stretched into weeks, the German nurses found themselves in a reality that defied everything they had been trained to expect. And yet, paradoxically, it was also the environment where their skills were most needed and most valued. Each morning, the nurses awoke to the rhythmic bustle of the medical tents, a chorus of movement and purpose that contrasted sharply with the chaos they had left behind in Normandy. The wounded arrived continuously, a mix of American soldiers with sunburned faces and hastily bandaged limbs, and German prisoners, young men whose fear and confusion were etched as deeply as their injuries. The initial tension that had gripped the nurses began to yield to the demands of the work, as they realized that in this space, the uniforms that had once divided them mattered far less than the pulse under their hands or the shallow breaths of those lying before them. Working alongside American doctors, the nurses discovered a rhythm both unfamiliar and profoundly instructive. Orders were rarely barked. Guidance came instead as suggestions or invitations to participate, an approach that both unsettled and empowered them. They were no longer mere instruments of the state, compelled to follow commands without thought or question. Here, in this strange intersection of skill and circumstance, they were collaborators, peers in a shared mission to preserve life. One nurse remembered the astonishment she felt when Captain William Harris, moving calmly from cot to cot, attended to a severely wounded soldier with the same meticulous care he offered an American infantryman, as if the uniform carried no moral or strategic weight. The principle was simple yet revolutionary. The body does not wear a uniform. In that quiet declaration, the nurses glimpsed a truth that had been denied to them, a revelation that challenged the very core of the ideology that had shaped their understanding of right and wrong. The work itself was physically exhausting and emotionally taxing. Stretchers were heavy, injuries were severe, and the continuous flow of patients allowed no space for fatigue to settle. Yet amid the demands of treatment, there was an undeniable sense of purpose, a clarity that had been absent in the chaos of retreat. Every dressing changed, every bandage applied, every intravenous line inserted reinforced a connection not to ideology but to human life itself. The nurses began to see that their role had shifted. They were no longer merely witnesses to the suffering of war, but active participants in its mitigation. Agents of care whose skill could alter outcomes in ways that ideology had never allowed them to consider. Interacting with American staff required adjustments that went beyond medical technique. Communication was often a patchwork of gestures, broken German, and halting English, yet these limitations did not hinder understanding. Instead, they fostered creativity and attentiveness, demanding that the nurses read subtle cues, anticipate needs, and act decisively. In doing, The nurses rediscovered aspects of their professional identity that had been suppressed in the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, where obedience had often outweighed initiative. The Americans' reliance on their judgment, and the respect with which it was met, became both a source of validation and a subtle challenge to their preconceptions about authority, power, and competence. The equality with which patients were treated became a lesson that extended beyond the practicalities of medicine. German and American soldiers, lying side by side on cots in varying states of injury, were attended with the same meticulous care, the same calm professionalism, and the same attention to pain and recovery. This impartiality unsettled the nurses at first. The rigid categories of friend and enemy, good and had been central to their worldview. Yet as they moved from one patient to another, observing the humanity in every face and the vulnerability in every limb, they began to internalize a principle that had little place in the ideology of the Reich, that the value of a life, the worth of a human being, does not depend on allegiance, nationality, or uniform. The act of treating a German soldier with the same care as an American one was not simply a professional duty, it was an ethical revelation, a quiet challenge to the assumptions that had governed their entire existence. As the nurses continued their work, moments of profound learning and subtle transformation accumulated. One evening, a German soldier winced as a dressing was changed, and a nurse instinctively adjusted her technique, murmuring words of reassurance in a voice that bridged languages. Nearby, an American doctor observed, offering a nod of approval without comment, signaling that competence, empathy, and attentiveness were the true measures of professionalism. The nurses began to see their own worth reflected in the trust of both their patients and their colleagues, experiencing for the first time a form of acknowledgement that had little to do with rank or ideology, and everything to do with skill and integrity. The hospital became a microcosm of a different kind of order, one built not on fear and obedience but on shared responsibility, respect for expertise, and the inherent dignity of those in need of care. These experiences challenged the nurses to reconsider the hierarchies they had internalized, to recognize the limitations of indoctrination, and to embrace the possibility that human connection could exist even in the shadow of conflict. They learned that collaboration across lines of nationality and former enmity could produce results that were both practical and profoundly human, and that respect for skill and compassion could reshape relationships in ways that no propaganda could anticipate. Through the weeks and months of this shared labor, the German nurses were transformed. Their professional pride, long subordinated to ideology and fear, was rekindled in a context of equality and trust. They learned that competence could command respect even without the trappings of power, that empathy could exist across divides constructed by war, and that their work had the power to bridge not only the physical injuries of the wounded, but also the emotional and ideological scars imposed by conflict. In treating both American and German soldiers with equal dedication, they came to understand that the essence of their calling transcended politics, uniforms, and national loyalties. Here, in the quiet intensity of the field hospital, they witnessed a form of humanity that defied expectation, nurtured life in the midst of destruction, and illuminated a path toward a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to serve others. It was a lesson that would endure long after the tents were folded and the war receded into history. Compassion and professionalism do not recognize boundaries drawn by politics, and the choice to treat every human being with dignity can reveal the truest measure of strength, courage, and humanity. The weeks the German nurses spent within the American field hospitals gradually became a crucible not only of medical practice, but of profound moral and psychological transformation, a process that quietly, yet irrevocably, undermined the ideological framework upon which they had been raised. conditioned by years of Nazi indoctrination to perceive hierarchy, obedience, and ideological purity as absolute virtues, the nurses initially approached their new roles with an almost instinctive tension, bracing for the strictures, insults, and rigid control that had always defined their experience within the Wehrmacht. They had been trained to obey without question, to measure worth according to allegiance, and to accept that the machinery of war required ruthlessness as a measure of strength. Yet in the strange, tented corridors of the American hospital, none of these assumptions held true, and the nurses were compelled, almost against their will, to confront the dissonance between their expectations and the reality unfolding before them. From the first day, it became apparent that authority here did not rely on intimidation or ideological enforcement. The American doctors, many of whom had been civilian practitioners drafted into service, treated the German nurses with a level of professional courtesy and trust that was foreign, unsettling, and yet deeply validating. Guidance was offered rather than imposed. Questions were welcomed rather than scorned, and expertise was recognized regardless of nationality. A nurse who had once performed her duties under the unyielding gaze of German officers, where a misstep could invite ridicule or punishment, now found herself consulted on treatment techniques, her opinions sought with genuine interest. These small gestures, seemingly mundane in the operational flow of the hospital, carried enormous symbolic weight, signaling that competence and dedication could command respect even without the enforcement of rank or the threat of reprisal. As days turned into weeks, the cumulative effect of this new environment began to manifest in unexpected ways. The nurses observed that the hierarchies they had internalized, the rigid distinctions between superior and subordinate, friend and enemy, were not universal laws but constructs, fragile and malleable. The equal treatment of patients, whether American infantrymen or young German conscripts, offered a constant, tangible lesson that human life held intrinsic value, independent of uniform, ideology, or past allegiance. This principle, embodied in the meticulous and impartial care provided by the American doctors, challenged the nurses to re-examine the ideological narratives that had shaped their perceptions for years, revealing the arbitrariness and cruelty of a system that equated obedience with moral worth and dehumanized those deemed adversaries. One nurse, recalling the experience years later in a diary entry later archived by American authorities, described the disorienting yet enlightening process of participating in this new hierarchy of respect. She had been asked to advise on a complex dressing procedure for a wounded soldier, a request that would have been inconceivable in her previous military environment, where knowledge flowed strictly from superior to subordinate, the actor being recognized for her expertise, treated as a peer rather than a mere cog in a machine, evoked a mixture of astonishment, pride, and unease. The boundaries of authority had shifted. Merit and skill, rather than rank or ideological alignment, now defined the nurse's place in this strange ecosystem. This was not merely a professional adjustment, it was a subtle, relentless challenge to the psychological structures imposed by years of totalitarian conditioning. The American approach to care extended beyond the technical aspects of medicine into the realms of human interaction and social conduct. Within the hospital, cultural and racial hierarchies that had been rigidly enforced elsewhere were rendered irrelevant, if not absurd. Black orderlies worked seamlessly alongside white staff, distributing instruments, managing supplies, and attending to patients with the same dedication and competence as their colleagues. The nurses, steeped in the doctrines of racial superiority promoted by the Nazi regime, were forced to reconcile the disparity between the propaganda they had been taught and the reality they witnessed daily. Efficiency, skill, and humanity were not bounded by skin color, nationality, or proximity. These observations eroded long-held assumptions. prompting an internal dialogue about the arbitrary nature of the divisions they had been trained to enforce and accept unquestioningly. Beyond the structural and social lessons, the nurses experienced a more intimate and immediate form of moral education through their daily interactions with patients and colleagues. Simple acts of respect, such as listening to a patient's complaint, responding to a colleague's suggestion, or offering assistance without hierarchy, became transformative exercises in humility and empathy. A young German conscript, his leg shattered and his face pale with shock, was treated with the same attentiveness and patience as a seasoned American soldier, demonstrating through action the profound power of impartial care. The nurses, witnessing and participating in this equality, gradually internalized a sense of moral autonomy, recognizing that compassion and professionalism could, and indeed must, transcend ideology. This quiet revolution in perspective extended to professional identity as well. The nurses began to reclaim their sense of self as skilled practitioners, rather than as instruments of a political machine. They discovered that their knowledge, honed through years of rigorous training, was valued for its intrinsic merit, not as a tool of domination or propaganda. A senior American surgeon, consulting with a German nurse on techniques for treating particularly stubborn infections, implicitly affirmed her expertise, demonstrating that respect could exist independently of national allegiance or prior status. The nurses' confidence grew alongside their realization that they could exercise judgment and initiative without fear of reprisal, a stark contrast to the rigid, punitive structures they had known in Germany. Over time, the combination of impartial patient care, collaborative practice, and recognition of individual expertise produced a profound psychological shift. The rigid hierarchies of the reach, the ideological insistence on obedience and dehumanization, began to crumble under the weight of lived experience. The nurses learned that equality, respect, and professional trust were not merely abstract ideals but practical, tangible principles that could guide their actions and interactions. Each day in the hospital reinforced the notion that true strength lay not in domination or cruelty, but in the capacity to act with skill, integrity, and humanity even in circumstances shaped by fear and conflict. By the time the nurses were eventually transported to permanent internment camps in the United States, they carried with them more than just medical experience. They had been exposed to a fundamentally different worldview, one in which respect, equality, and competence defined social and professional interactions. The lessons learned in the hospital tents extended far beyond the immediate context of war, leaving indelible impressions on their understanding of human value and moral responsibility. The American approach had quietly but decisively dismantled the assumptions that had governed their lives, revealing a truth that could not be unlearned, that every human being, regardless of prior allegiance, is deserving of dignity, that expertise commands recognition without coercion, and that a system built on fear and hierarchy is infinitely weaker than one built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. Through this experience, the nurses came to understand that the most profound victories in life are often not measured in battlefield conquests or territorial gains, but in the quiet reclamation of humanity, the recognition of equality, and the exercise of compassion that transcends the divisions imposed by ideology, circumstance, or war. The lessons of those weeks in the American hospitals would remain with them forever, testament to the enduring power of respect, equality, and the quiet moral courage required to see and act upon the shared humanity in every life. The German nurses, thrust into this unfamiliar world where the rules of hierarchy and loyalty no longer applied, found themselves navigating a moral and psychological landscape that was as demanding as the physical labor of tending to the wounded. Each day brought new tests, not of skill alone, but of conscience, as they confronted a reality in which compassion and professionalism were extended indiscriminately. dissolving the rigid barriers they had been taught to uphold. In the field hospitals of the United States, a soldier's nationality, former allegiance, or even the uniforms that had once marked friend and enemy mattered far less than the pulse beneath their fingers, the shallow breath trembling in a chest, or the quiet plea behind a winced grimace. This impartial care was disorienting. It struck at the foundation of their indoctrination and forced them to reconcile the idealized notions of the reach with a world in which human dignity transcended politics. At first, the nurses struggled to reconcile their instincts with the expectations imposed upon them. When an American doctor handed them a clean bandage for a German prisoner with a shattered arm, the immediate reflex was suspicion and disbelief. How could the enemy, whose soldiers had just fought them, treat them or those they served with such basic decency? Yet, as they followed the doctor's guidance and performed their tasks, the simple, consistent demonstration of care began to chip away at long-held convictions. It was in the repetitive acts, the careful cleansing of wounds, the precise application of dressings, the quiet encouragement whispered to a trembling patient that the nurses observed the profound efficacy of impartial compassion. Each successful intervention reinforced the stark contrast between the moral calculus they had been taught and the reality in which care and professionalism were not contingent on loyalty or ideology. The psychological conflict this created was relentless. In their diaries and letters, several nurses recounted the internal turbulence provoked by these experiences. One wrote of a young German soldier, no older than 17, whose leg had been shattered by artillery fire. As she tended to his wound alongside American colleagues, she felt a confusing surge of empathy that conflicted with years of indoctrination instructing her to see enemies as lesser beings, obstacles to be overcome rather than humans to be saved. The empathy was undeniable, yet it carried a silent, gnawing tension. To feel compassion for those once deemed unworthy was, by the standards of the Reach, an act of betrayal. And yet, the work demanded nothing less than full engagement, requiring that personal and political preconceptions be set aside in favor of immediate, life-saving action. The nurses' moral awakening was compounded by the behavior of the American doctors, whose consistent impartiality left no room for rationalizing prejudice. Captain William Harris, for instance, treated every patient with the same meticulous attention, whether the individual was a seasoned American infantryman or a young German prisoner, demonstrating through action that ethical care was not conditional. Observing this, the nurses experienced a cognitive dissonance that was at once jarring and enlightening. They began to question the narratives that had framed their understanding of strength, power, and virtue, recognizing that cruelty and domination were not hallmarks of capability, but of weakness disguised as authority. Each patient they treated, each interaction in which they were trusted to exercise judgment without coercion, became a lesson in the practical application of moral courage, teaching them that the value of life and skill was not dictated by allegiance but by principle and human decency. The hospital became a crucible where professional competence intertwined with ethical introspection. Nurses were asked to make decisions, improvise techniques, and observe protocols not for political approval but for the well-being of patients. In this environment, they realized that their prior adherence to strict military hierarchy and ideological dictates had often suppressed not only their initiative but their very sense of humanity. The act of being treated as a capable professional, consulted for advice, and recognized for skill created an identity independent of rank or nationality, one rooted in the intrinsic value of expertise and care. It was a revelation that challenged the psychological foundations of the worldview they had been taught to uphold, creating a subtle yet persistent tension between the comfort of obedience and the empowerment of independent moral agency. Moments of shared humanity further intensified this internal conflict. when an American orderly dropped a tray of surgical instruments. 2 German nurses instinctively bent to assist him, and in the brief exchange of glances, a silent acknowledgement of mutual reliance and trust passed between them. These fleeting moments, though small in scope, crystallized the contrast between the dehumanizing instructions of the Reach and the collaborative, egalitarian approach they witnessed in practice. They began to see that true professionalism, rooted in empathy and respect, could transcend the artificial divisions of nationality, ideology, and rank. Each interaction reinforced the concept that moral integrity and human compassion were not luxuries but necessities in the practice of life-saving medicine. Yet, the psychological challenge was not solely internal. Relationships among the nurses themselves became sites of tension and negotiation as differing responses to their new reality surfaced. Some clung stubbornly to nationalist loyalty, wary of the Americans' intentions and determined to maintain allegiance to the ideology they had been taught. Others, influenced by the consistent display of impartial care and professional respect, began to embrace the emerging moral framework, defending the value of assisting all patients equally. These ideological conflicts played out quietly but intensely, their dormitory conversations and whispered debates marking a secondary battleground where the forces of old indoctrination and emerging conscience collided. The dynamic was simultaneously tense and illuminating, revealing that the transformation occurring in the wards extended into the very core of personal identity, reshaping notions of duty, loyalty, and ethical responsibility. As time passed, the accumulation of experiences, the impartial care of patients, the respect shown by American staff, and the collaborative practice that defied hierarchical norms produced a profound shift. The nurses came to understand that the exercise of compassion and professionalism, regardless of nationality, was not a betrayal but a revelation of human strength. They learned that moral courage often manifests in small, consistent acts of care, and that such acts can unsettle long-held assumptions while simultaneously affirming the enduring worth of human life. By navigating these moral and psychological challenges, the nurses redefined their professional and personal identities, embracing a vision of humanity that transcended the rigid, dehumanizing constructs of the ideology that had once governed their existence. In the quiet of the field hospital, amid the clatter of stretchers, the scent of antiseptics, and the murmur of recovery, the German nurses confronted an enduring truth, that ethical action is not bound by uniform, allegiance, or fear, and that the consistent exercise of compassion and professionalism can illuminate the shared humanity that war and ideology so often seek to obscure. Each day in this environment forged a deeper understanding that the measures of strength and morality lie not in dominance or obedience, but in the capacity to recognize and honor the dignity of every human being, and to act upon that recognition with unwavering resolve. As the German nurses settled into the rhythm of their new environment, their attention began to extend beyond the immediate demands of patient care to the broader organization of the American field hospitals, a landscape that seemed at once familiar in purpose yet profoundly foreign in execution. They noted the precision of procedures, the meticulous order in which instruments were sterilized, gauze was stacked, and morphine was distributed, a scale of efficiency that surpassed anything they had witnessed in the collapsing medical infrastructure of Germany. In the Reach, scarcity and rigid command often dictated practice, forcing nurses to improvise within constrained and chaotic systems. Yet here was a model where abundance and methodical organization coexisted, creating a flow that seemed almost effortless despite the sheer volume of wounded soldiers streaming through the tents. This operational prowess was striking not only for its technical mastery but for the philosophy underpinning it. That competence and care were inseparable, that a system built on preparation, planning, and trust in human skill could achieve outcomes far beyond the reach of fear and authoritarian discipline. Perhaps more jarring than the mechanical precision was the social composition of the staff. a living contradiction to the rigid racial hierarchies so relentlessly propagated in Nazi Germany. The nurses observed black orderlies moving through the wards with the same authority, efficiency, and ease as their white counterparts. Their presence accepted without question, their contributions recognized and relied upon in a seamless choreography of teamwork. In the Reich, propaganda had drilled into them the image of a degenerate, morally inferior America, a society weakened by racial mixing and social disorder. Yet the reality before them challenged every assumption. African American staff were not only competent but integral, their skill and reliability unquestioned, their presence normalized in a way that rendered racial identity irrelevant to professional effectiveness. Witnessing this, the nurses experienced a cognitive shock, a quiet, insistent questioning that began at the edge of perception and gradually forced itself into conscious reflection. The ideologies that had defined their understanding of order, power, and hierarchy were not just absent here, they were demonstrably ineffective in the face of real human collaboration. The integration of race within the hospital operations also intersected with lessons in respect and equality that had already begun to unsettle the nurses' worldview. In Germany, status and racial classification determined the level of care a patient might receive, with enemies often receiving minimal attention and marginalized groups systematically devalued. Yet in the American hospitals, every patient was approached with uniform seriousness, every task carried out with the same meticulous attention regardless of the individual's background. This impartiality extended beyond patient care into the social dynamics of the staff itself. The German nurses, accustomed to rigid social stratification and hierarchical control, found themselves participating in a community where competence and collaboration mattered more than age, race, or nationality. The efficiency of the system was inseparable from this egalitarian ethos, and the nurses quickly recognized that the operational success they witnessed was reinforced by the mutual respect and trust embedded in these relationships. Beyond the immediate operational contrasts, the nurses were drawn to the understated human gestures that permeated the hospital. An African American orderly might pass instruments to a white surgeon with a casual nod, a small exchange but one imbued with significance, a moment that challenged years of internalized propaganda in a single, silent act. Observing these interactions, the nurses began to realize that the social cohesion and effectiveness of the hospital were products not of coercion or enforced hierarchy, but of shared purpose and recognition of individual competence. The cumulative effect of these observations was profound. It was as though the very logic of the Reich's worldview, the notion that social and racial hierarchy equated to strength, that obedience and control were the engines of order, was being dismantled in the ordinary course of daily operations. The operational excellence of the American hospitals also offered a mirror against which the nurses could measure their own practices, revealing not just the deficiencies of the German system, but the potential for a different professional ethic. Procedures were standardized yet adaptable. Materials were abundant yet used judiciously. And communication was clear yet non-authoritarian. For the nurses, accustomed to rigidly dictated routines enforced with fear and severity, this represented a revelation that discipline and order need not be maintained through intimidation or ideology, that efficiency could coexist with humanity, and that the successful management of medical crises required not subservience but engagement, not fear but respect. The implications for their understanding of leadership and competence were immense, extending beyond the hospital to challenge the very assumptions on which they had been trained to build their professional identity. As weeks passed, these lessons deepened, becoming more than mere observations. The nurses began to internalize a philosophy of practice in which respect for colleagues, impartiality in patient care, and adherence to rigorous standards were mutually reinforcing rather than conflicting priorities. They observed that African American orderlies and white staff did not merely tolerate one another, they depended upon one another. their cooperation essential to maintaining the flow of care for hundreds of wounded soldiers each day. This model of interdependence, operational efficiency, and egalitarian respect became an invisible curriculum, imparting insights about both human nature and organizational dynamics that no lecture or manual could convey. The contrast with the Nazi framework could not have been more stark. In the hospitals of the Reich, ideology had dictated the value of human life and the allocation of medical attention, creating a rigid, morally compromised system in which power and fear outweighed expertise and compassion. Here, in the American field hospitals, every act of care, every efficient maneuver, and every equitable interaction underscored a radically different set of priorities. Life, skill, and respect were the true currencies of authority and effectiveness. For the nurses, this realization produced a complex mixture of awe, confusion, and quiet relief. They were witnessing a demonstration not merely of medical prowess, but of an ethical framework that elevated humanity above ideology, efficiency above hierarchy, and collaboration above coercion. By the time they had become fully acclimated to this environment, the nurses understood that their exposure to these efficient, racially integrated operations had reshaped their perception of what was possible in both professional and human terms. The lessons were operational, ethical, and deeply personal, revealing that effective systems of care could function at immense scale while remaining humane, that racial integration could be practical and unremarkable, and that ideology need not dictate the measure of a person's value. These insights, quietly absorbed through observation and practice, left an indelible mark on their professional consciousness and their understanding of the broader human landscape, forging a lasting recognition that respect, competence, and equality were not only possible but essential for achieving both excellence and justice in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The German nurses came to realize, often in small but cumulative ways, that the ideological constructs they had been taught to venerate were not absolute truths but fragile myths, easily dismantled by the reality of competence, collaboration, and human decency. Their time in the American hospitals offered a blueprint for a professional ethic grounded in fairness, efficiency, and universal respect, a stark and transformative contrast to the world from which they had come, leaving them to carry forward lessons that would resonate long after the war ended and the tents had been folded away. As the days passed within the American camps, the German nurses found themselves confronting a deeper, more personal battlefield than any they had faced in the maelstrom of Normandy. The struggle between ingrained loyalty to the Reich and the ethical imperatives of their profession, the sacred oath they had taken as healers. In the quiet hours after the hospital wards fell silent and the distant hum of camp life receded into the night, the barracks became a crucible for thought, a space where unspoken tensions could finally surface. Conversations, once constrained by suspicion and fear, began to explore the dissonance between duty imposed by ideology and duty dictated by conscience. One nurse would speak in a low voice about the disquieting moments in the field hospital, when she had applied a dressing to a German boy's shrapnel wound beside an American soldier, recognizing that the care she provided was no longer governed by nationality but by need, while another would remind her that to act in this way was to betray the Reich and everything she had been taught to uphold. The discussions were often heated yet introspective, marked by an intensity born from shared experience and close quarters. Within these wooden barracks, separated from the structured hierarchies and rigid command structures of their former military lives, nurses explored questions that had previously been abstract or forbidden. What does loyalty mean when the entity you have served has proven morally bankrupt? Can professional obligation to preserve life coexist with ideological obedience? Or are the two inherently incompatible? The barracks echoed with whispered confessions. the nervous scratching of pen on paper as nurses documented their inner conflicts in diaries, and the subtle yet piercing glances exchanged between colleagues who were equally unsure of how to navigate this ethical terrain. Each night became an exercise in self-examination, as the women grappled with the realization that the world they had been taught to honor and defend was neither just nor morally coherent, and that their skills could serve a higher purpose if divorced from the propaganda that had shaped their upbringing. Some nurses found themselves caught in a particularly acute struggle. They had been trained to equate obedience to authority with virtue, to view deviation from the orders of superiors as a moral failing, and yet the reality before them demanded independent judgment, moral reasoning, and the courage to act against expectation. A senior nurse, recalling her time in Germany, described to a bunkmate how she had once punished a subordinate for minor errors, convinced that discipline was the essence of professional integrity, and now found herself watching American doctors solicit advice from junior German nurses with an openness and respect that seemed alien. The resulting cognitive tension was profound. How could one reconcile the ingrained hierarchy and the notion of loyalty with the evidence that ethical care and professional efficacy thrived in a framework of equality, consultation, and mutual respect? Rumors and small stories circulated like wildfire, amplifying both tension and insight. One nurse shared that an American doctor had praised the efficiency of a younger German colleague, bestowing upon her a recognition that was not awarded for compliance but for competence. Another recounted a late-night conversation in which a fellow nurse questioned the morality of withholding care from any patient, regardless of nationality, observing that in the American system, every life mattered equally, and that in practice, ethical obligation trumped political allegiance. These stories sparked debates that could last hours, often breaking down into arguments fueled by fear, guilt, or pride, as nurses attempted to articulate the inchoate feelings that their experiences in the camps had awakened. Some argued that adherence to the Reach's ideology remained a moral anchor, a guide in an uncertain world, while others insisted that the oath to heal was a higher, universal duty that transcended politics. The barracks, with their narrow bunks and dim lighting, became a theater for these silent and spoken conflicts. Private confessions and hurried diary entries revealed the psychic toll of this ethical struggle. Nurses wrestled with the paradox of gratitude toward the Americans who had treated them with dignity, while simultaneously feeling the pull of ingrained loyalty to a nation that had demanded unquestioning obedience. The duality created a state of suspended identity. They were no longer fully soldiers of the Reach, yet they were not entirely free to abandon the principles they had internalized. Each interaction with American staff reinforced the moral challenge, subtly shifting the nurses' perception of duty and loyalty. And each successful intervention in patient care validated the emergent framework in which ethical action and professional skill were inseparable. Within this crucible, small acts became profound catalysts for reflection. When a nurse assisted in transferring a wounded German soldier onto a stretcher, guided by an American doctor who treated her as a peer, she experienced a quiet affirmation of her professional identity, a reminder that her skill and judgment were valuable independent of ideology. Yet, that same act elicited tension among her peers who remained bound to nationalist loyalty, resulting in whispered criticisms or cautious questioning of motives. These interpersonal dynamics transformed the barracks into a microcosm of moral negotiation, where each woman was confronted with choices that were at once personal, professional, and ethical. The constant balancing of competing loyalties created a heightened awareness of the distinction between orders imposed by authority and actions dictated by conscience, challenging the very foundation of the obedience that had structured their former lives. Over time, the cumulative effect of these discussions and reflections became evident in subtle behavioral changes. Nurses began to anticipate the needs of patients without direct instruction, consulted one another for advice across national lines, and experimented with collaborative solutions in medical procedures that would have been unthinkable under the rigid militaristic hierarchy of the Reach. The act of exercising independent judgment, once associated with insubordination, became a reaffirmation of their professional integrity and a statement of ethical autonomy. The tension between loyalty to the Reach and the oath to heal did not vanish, but it evolved, transforming from a source of paralyzing conflict into a driver of moral and intellectual growth. In this environment, the nurses discovered that their professional oath provided a compass in the ethical ambiguity of captivity, one that could coexist with, yet ultimately challenge, the ideologies they had been trained to uphold. They realized that loyalty to humanity, the imperative to alleviate suffering, and the commitment to apply their skills with impartiality were more enduring and consequential than the dictates of any nation or regime. The conversations, debates, and introspections that filled the barracks were thus not merely acts of reflection, but exercises in reclaiming moral agency, redefining identity, and navigating a path between the demands of ideology and the imperatives of conscience, leaving an indelible mark on each nurse's understanding of duty, loyalty, and the enduring power of ethical action in the face of complex human circumstances. In the midst of the controlled chaos of the American field hospitals, a remarkable transformation began to take shape among the German nurses, one that challenged not only their expectations, but the very core of their professional identity. Initially, many had approached their new duties with a mixture of fear, suspicion, and resignation, conditioned to believe that their capture would signify the absolute loss of status, autonomy, and dignity. Yet as days turned into weeks, a subtle but profound shift occurred. American medical officers, rather than imposing rigid commands or treating the German staff as mere subordinates, began to seek their input, asking for guidance on procedures, techniques, and patient care strategies. This simple act of consultation was revolutionary for the nurses, who had been accustomed to a hierarchical structure in which orders flowed strictly from superior officers to obedient subordinates, where questioning authority was tantamount to defiance and any deviation from protocol could carry severe consequences. The first moments when a nurse realized she was being asked for advice were surreal, almost dreamlike, a collision between expectation and reality that left her momentarily paralyzed. In one notable instance, a senior German nurse who had spent years managing wartime triage under the constant pressure of scarcity and strict military discipline was approached by Lieutenant Robert Klein, an American surgeon struggling with a complex infection in a wounded soldier. With a calm voice and steady eyes, he asked for her opinion on a drainage technique she had employed in the field, valuing her expertise as though it were equal to his own. For the nurse, accustomed to a world where rank and nationality defined authority, this was both astonishing and profoundly validating. It was not merely a professional acknowledgement. It was a recognition of her humanity and her intrinsic worth beyond the uniform she wore. This restoration of professional pride did not occur in isolation, but reverberated through the hospital, creating a ripple effect among the other German nurses, observing their peers being treated as skilled colleagues rather than captured enemies. They began to reinterpret their own roles. The repetitive, precise actions they performed dressing wounds, managing infections, monitoring vital signs were no longer exercises in compliance under duress. They were contributions valued for their competence, knowledge, and practical efficacy. A sense of agency returned, subtle at first, manifesting in careful suggestions, proactive care, and a willingness to collaborate across language barriers and national divides. With every patient attended and every recommendation considered, the nurses felt their professional identity realign, shifting from that of a defeated instrument of the reach to that of a respected practitioner whose skill was recognized on its own merit. The psychological impact of this shift was profound. Many nurses had internalized the idea, propagated through years of Nazi indoctrination, that their worth was tied to loyalty, obedience, and service to the state, and that recognition could only be bestowed through hierarchical channels of authority. The American approach, which valued competence, mutual respect, and shared responsibility, undermined these assumptions and forced a revaluation of what it meant to be a professional, a healer, and a human being. They learned that influence and authority could stem from knowledge and skill, rather than rank or ideology, and that recognition could be freely given across lines of nationality and former enmity. In this environment, their hands, once instruments of duty dictated by rigid orders, became instruments of choice, guided by expertise and ethical responsibility. The exchange of knowledge also served as a bridge between cultures and experiences. German nurses shared techniques perfected under the extreme conditions of the European theater methods for managing infections with limited resources, improvisational strategies for treating battlefield injuries, and nuanced approaches to patient stabilization. In turn, American medical staff demonstrated advanced logistical systems, abundant resources, and new surgical techniques that the nurses had rarely encountered. This bidirectional flow of knowledge fostered not only professional growth, but also mutual respect, as each contribution was assessed on its practical merit rather than the identity of its source. What had once been a unidirectional relationship of power and submission was now a dynamic interchange where expertise mattered more than allegiance, and collaboration replaced hierarchy as the guiding principle of the wards. As their skills were sought and valued, the German nurses experienced a quiet but profound shift in self-perception. No longer simply cogs in a wartime machine, they were recognized as autonomous professionals, their judgment trusted, their observations respected. For some, the moment of consultation was transformative. A young nurse guiding an American officer through a complex procedure might feel a surge of confidence, recalling that her knowledge, hard-earned and honed under impossible circumstances, was relevant and indispensable. For others, it reinforced a sense of purpose, reminding them why they had entered the nursing profession long before being swept into the machinery of war, before ideology had sought to redefine their values and worth. This evolving dynamic reshaped identity in a broader sense as well. The German nurses began to reconcile their past experiences with the present reality, understanding that professional competence and ethical practice transcended the boundaries of nation, uniform, and political ideology. They started to internalize a framework in which their responsibility to heal was paramount, where their expertise commanded respect regardless of the patient's or colleague's origin. The psychological liberation that accompanied this recognition was accompanied by a renewed commitment to excellence, a sense that their work mattered not merely because it was required, but because it was valuable, effective, and morally consequential. By the time the nurses were fully acclimated to this environment of mutual respect and professional exchange, their identities had been profoundly reshaped. The consultation they received from American officers restored a sense of pride that had been eroded by defeat and captivity, allowing them to reclaim a professional selfhood that was independent of ideology and recognized on its own merit. In the quiet moments between shifts, as they reflected on the wounded in their care and the trust placed in their hands, they realized that their skills had the power to bridge divides, to transcend former enmities, and to affirm their humanity. This restoration of agency, competence, and dignity became a defining experience of their captivity, leaving an enduring imprint on their understanding of what it truly meant to be a healer and a professional. and providing a profound lesson in the universality of respect and the enduring value of expertise, regardless of circumstance or allegiance. In every consultation, every request for advice, and every moment of collaboration, the German nurses discovered not only the technical value of their expertise, but also the moral and personal affirmation that had been denied them under the rigid hierarchy of the Reich, forging a new sense of self that balanced skill, integrity, and humanity in ways that would resonate long after the tents were folded and the war had ended. As the final months of the war receded into history, and the German nurses prepared to leave the camps that had become a strange intersection of captivity, learning, and moral revelation, a quiet understanding settled over them, one that would linger long after uniforms were folded, diaries tucked away, and the hum of hospital lamps faded. The journey they had endured through the chaos of Normandy, the uncertainty of capture, and the extraordinary experience of working alongside the Americans who had once been their enemies had revealed a truth more profound than any battlefield victory or political decree: that true strength is not measured by power, rank, or the ability to enforce obedience, but by the courage to act with compassion, even in the most harrowing circumstances. From the very first hesitant step into the American field hospital, where fear had almost frozen them in place, to the quiet acts of guidance and collaboration that eventually became routine, the nurses discovered that empathy could bridge seemingly insurmountable divides. They had been taught that allegiance to the Reich defined not only their duty but their worth, that the hierarchy of their nation had created a rigid calculus in which some lives mattered more than others. Yet in the sterile light of the tents, surrounded by the groans of wounded soldiers, German and American alike, they witnessed the dismantling of this cruel arithmetic. Every patient they treated received the same careful attention, the same delicate touch, the same measured words of comfort. The uniform on the body no longer dictated the quality of care. Instead, skill, patience, and moral choice shaped each action. This revelation was not merely professional, but deeply personal. For nurses who had spent years internalizing an ideology that equated strength with cruelty, who had been told that showing mercy was weakness, the experience was a shock to the very foundation of their understanding. Each successful intervention, each moment when a patient's fever broke or a wound began to heal, became proof that compassion was not only effective but powerful. It offered a resilience and a moral authority that no command structure or propaganda campaign could replicate. The lessons of the field hospital extended beyond medicine. They demonstrated that humanity itself could flourish in circumstances that had once seemed designed to strip it away. Beyond the technical skill and practical knowledge they had exchanged with American colleagues, the German nurses carried with them the subtler, more enduring lessons of equality and respect, witnessing racially integrated staff working seamlessly together, observing colleagues treating each other and patients with dignity regardless of past enmity. They realized that the world they had been taught to fear was not only capable of functioning without hatred, but could thrive through cooperation, understanding, and mutual regard. This exposure challenged long-held assumptions, forcing the nurses to question what truly constituted strength, leadership, and ethical behavior. The quiet, deliberate respect shown by American officers, the recognition of their professional expertise, and the opportunity to exercise judgment freely had collectively reshaped their sense of self and their understanding of the moral universe. Even after the war officially ended and the gates of the camps swung open, signaling freedom, the lessons learned within those tents lingered. The nurses left not only with the memories of their captivity, but with an awareness that compassion could be a form of strength more enduring than any victory won through force. The friendships, collaborations, and shared experiences across national lines were living proof that humanity could transcend ideology, uniform, and historical enmity. Each step away from the camp, every glance at the endless fields of America rolling toward the horizon, became a reminder of the possibility for moral courage and ethical clarity in a world too often defined by conflict and division. For the nurses, this insight was transformative. It reframed their understanding of duty, not as blind obedience to authority or ideology, but as a commitment to preserve life, alleviate suffering, and act with integrity. They had learned that even in war, in circumstances designed to dehumanize, there existed the capacity to exercise choice, to affirm dignity, and to recognize the shared humanity of others. These lessons, carried silently in diaries, in conversations with fellow nurses, and in private reflection, would inform not only their professional lives but their personal philosophies long after the uniforms were put away. As we reflect on their story today, it reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, moments of ethical courage and moral clarity can shine through, offering a lesson that transcends time and geography. Compassion, respect, and professionalism are not weaknesses but sources of enduring strength, and humanity can flourish even where ideology and conflict seek to divide. The courage to treat others with dignity, to prioritize care over prejudice, and to act with moral conviction is a testament to the capacity for ethical action that exists within each of us. Thank you for joining us in exploring this remarkable story, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of compassion. If you found this journey through history inspiring, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that illuminate the courage, ethics, and humanity that continue to shape our world. Remember, history is more than dates and battles, it is the lives of people, their choices, and the moments when they rise above fear and ideology to act with true strength. Learn from the past, cherish the human connections,